At one point, he was among the most decorated and revered Ukrainian officers, the commander of Ukraine's 36th Brigade, a soldier who guarded Crimea with his life and commanded his troops with respect. But then Russia annexed Crimea, and the officer betrayed Ukraine. Now that very officer is leading one of Russia's most damaging offensives. Only the damage is being done to his own forces. The irony is brutal as Ukraine's traitor now commands Russia's greatest failures. That man is Lieutenant General Serhiy Storozhenko, and his story is one of betrayal, failure, and humiliation. As a decorated officer, Storozhenko was supposed to be a man upon whom Ukraine could rely to protect Crimea when Vladimir Putin attempted to annex the peninsula. He commanded the 36th Brigade, which was the largest land component of the Ukrainian Navy at the time. So he had more than enough men following his lead to put up a fight against Russia. At the very least, Storozhenko could have held his ground until aid or orders came from Ukraine's high command. But the lieutenant general didn't do that. Instead, he gave the order to surrender. That order came on May 2, 2014, the Virtual Museum of Russian Aggression wrote in 2022. It was on this day that Storozhenko and his brigade's military town were surrounded by Russia's invading forces. Storozhenko didn't even consider fighting. There was no order to confront the enemy or hold ground. Storozhenko simply told his soldiers to lay down their arms and surrender the entire brigade to the Russians, betraying the brigade's oath in the process. That oath was to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. Storozhenko handed Crimea over on a silver platter. Those who might want to be kind to Storozhenko could claim that he made this decision to protect his soldiers. They were outnumbered and outgunned. So surrender may have been the most prudent decision. It wasn't, and some of Storozhenko's soldiers knew it. The museum claims that a few of the soldiers once under Storozhenko's command disobeyed his orders and followed the commander of the Mountain Infantry Battalion, Yuri Holovashenko. Under Holovashenko's command, those soldiers created a circular defense and prepared to do battle against Russia. Unfortunately, it was all for naught. Most of Storozhenko's forces stayed with him in the newly occupied peninsula, with only those who had left his command in anger returning to the Ukrainian mainland so they could continue to uphold their military oath to their country. In the aftermath of the debacle, Storozhenko tried to save face. Those who'd witnessed him give his order recalled that he not only told his soldiers to surrender their weapons, but to also side with the Russian occupiers that would otherwise have tried to kill them. Storozhenko tried to claim that wasn't the case. RFU News says he'd merely resigned from his post and he'd made no attempt to join up with the Russian forces. It wouldn't take long for that story to be proven as a lie. With the occupation of Crimea complete, Russia held a phony referendum on the peninsula, RFU News says. According to RFU News, a week after the results of that referendum came in, Storozhenko received a Russian passport. This must have been his place from the start. By handing over Crimea, by surrendering the Ukrainian Navy's largest land force, the traitor got in good with Russia. He became a Russian citizen. Not only that, but he earned himself a new career. Very soon after the annexation of Crimea, Storozhenko found himself at the head of a brand new brigade, a Russian brigade. The betrayal was complete. And with his awarding of a new role so soon after his order to lay down arms, Storozhenko proved to his former country that this was his plan all along. Storozhenko wasn't a man who'd found himself facing a threat against which he couldn't contend. He wasn't a coward. That could be understood, if not necessarily forgiven. Storozhenko was an opportunist, one who had seen a way to ingratiate himself with the Russian invaders, even if it meant surrendering his honor and an entire peninsula that had been placed under his protection. Storozhenko's betrayal had a massive impact on Ukraine. iNews has even more details. The traitor was a graduate of Ukraine's Kyiv Army Academy, where he received his education in the reconnaissance department. By iNews' account, he was an exceptional student who displayed extraordinary military prowess, which is what led to his rising to such a prominent position in Crimea in the first place. Storozhenko's betrayal damaged Ukrainian morale at the time, but a lot worse was to come. In the period between the annexation of Crimea and the launch of Putin's Ukraine invasion, Storozhenko spent his time quietly moving up the Russian military's ranks. He was more than happy to do what his new country told him to do, and by the time 2022 came around, Storozhenko was the chief of staff of the 35th Army of Russia's Eastern Military District. The traitor hadn't just disappeared into the Russian military hierarchy, he was leading a group of soldiers who would, from the very beginning, be taking part in Putin's invasion. Storozhenko was supposed to be dangerous. A man who knew Ukraine better than almost anybody else in Russia's military, and somebody with the tactical nous and skill to cause serious damage. Only that's not how it's gone for the Ukrainian traitor. Time and time again, he has failed in everything that Russia has asked him to do. Storozhenko's first major failure came in the Kharkiv region. As part of the 35th Army, Storozhenko led the initial invasion into that region, and for a time, he experienced some success. At least it was a success in the sense that his troops did what Putin wanted, brutalized Kharkiv while killing civilians and razing portions of the region to the ground. However, it was in this initial assault that the cracks started to show. Much like Putin himself, Storozhenko had never expected Ukraine to fight back so fiercely. Perhaps he had fooled himself into thinking that the soldiers he was sent to fight would be just as willing to turn their backs on their country as he was. Storozhenko was wrong. Under Storozhenko, Russia managed to establish a main bastion in the settlement of Izium. From here, Russia's forces were supposed to advance deeper into Kharkiv, eventually taking the entire region. But far from using Izium as a launch pad for further victories, Storozhenko and his soldiers found themselves desperately defending the bastion. It was meant to be their stronghold. It wouldn't be long before Russia's forces crumbled. On September 10, 2022, Russia abandoned Izium altogether as Storozhenko's forces collapsed in the face of a rapid Ukrainian advance. Al Jazeera labeled the incident as the worst defeat Russia has experienced since it was pushed back from the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv during the early weeks of the invasion. Reporting from the scene, Al Jazeera's Gabriel Elizondo revealed that Izium had been a key military stronghold for Russia inside Ukraine, especially due to its role as a logistical hub, serving Russian forces elsewhere in the country. Russia had fought long and hard to establish that stronghold, only to have all of that hard work undone in a matter of days. It took the Russians 6 weeks of fighting to get a hold of that city, and now it appears that the Ukrainians will have retaken it in pretty much a 12 to 24-hour time frame, Elizondo told Al Jazeera. Storozhenko may have just proven himself not to have the brilliant military mind so many in Ukraine believed him to have. Still, his 35th Army left behind a trail of devastation in its former stronghold. Even before Storozhenko's forces were pushed out of Izium, there was evidence that the traitor was doing more than just fighting against Ukraine's army. He was ordering his soldiers to kill civilians with no mercy. In May 2022, the BBC reported that the bodies of at least 44 Ukrainian civilians had been found under the rubble of Izium. All had been victims of a 5-story residential building collapsing under the force of Russia's shelling, showcasing how little regard Storozhenko had for his former country people. By September 2022, when Storozhenko's forces were finally pushed out of Izium, The Guardian was reporting that the city may have become another Bucha. For those who don't know, Bucha represents the site of Russia's most terrible war crimes against Ukraine. Russia engaged in the mass murder of civilians and prisoners of war in Bucha, the extent of which still isn't fully known. By August 2022, the bodies of at least 458 Ukrainian civilians had been recovered in Bucha, 419 of whom were confirmed to have died as a result of some form of military action. 12 of the dead were children. Most had been shot in close range with signs of torture in a style resembling a mob hit or execution. Izium was similarly devastated by Storozhenko and Russia's 35th Army. Most of Izium has been destroyed. The main boulevard is full of gutted apartment blocks and walls pockmarked by bullets. The administration building is an eerie, sandbagged ruin. A bomb tore a chunk out of a church's cupola. The city's road bridge has been destroyed, with residents getting around on bikes, The Guardian reported in September 2022. Storozhenko had showcased his brutality, but Ukraine had highlighted the traitor's failings. The former Crimean commander had utterly failed to hold the stronghold he'd spent months trying to capture. Thanks to Storozhenko's failure, combined with Ukraine's brilliant counterattack, Russia's Kharkiv ambitions were set back to the point where Putin's forces are still trying to capture the region over 3 years later. For any other military, this abject failure on Storozhenko's part would have been enough to strip him of his command. He was responsible for making the invasion a whole lot harder for Russia going forward, and yet that's not what Putin did. Far from being punished for his failure, Storozhenko was rewarded. In 2023, Storozhenko was promoted under an order signed directly by Putin to become the commander of Russia's 6th Army. After throwing away the lives of soldiers and civilians alike in Izium, Storozhenko was going to be given the command of another group that would be responsible for storming the Ukrainian city of Kupyansk. That second city would become the site of an even greater failure for the traitor than Izium, but we'll come back to that in a moment. First, questions have to be asked about how Putin decided that a man who had failed so dramatically should be given another chance, and not just any chance, an opportunity to lead another of Russia's most important charges against Ukraine. It can't have been because Storozhenko was a stellar commander. He'd betrayed Ukraine in Crimea and failed in Kharkiv. Perhaps Putin was impressed by the former Ukrainian officer's brutality. Storozhenko had overseen the deaths of many in Izium, showing no compassion for his former country people. That may be the sort of quality Putin admired. Or perhaps Russia's president thought that the sacrifice of having such an incompetent commander was worth it, for the simple fact that he could parade Storozhenko as a commander who'd realized the error of his ways, a turncoat who was fighting for Russia because he believed that Russia should control Ukraine. Whatever the case may be, Storozhenko was promoted to the rank of lieutenant general and went to oversee Russia's forces in Kupyansk. It's unknown precisely when Storozhenko was sent to Kupyansk, though it's possible he may have been operating in the region since 2023. But by September 19th, Ukraine knew for sure that their traitorous commander was heading the forces attempting to invade the vital city. Liga reports that the Dnipro Operational and Strategic Group of Troops spokesperson Nazar Voloshin has confirmed that Russia has created a Kharkiv group of troops that is currently assaulting Kupyansk. That group includes the 6th Combined Arms Army, which Storozhenko now commands. It's in Kupyansk that Storozhenko is in the midst of yet another failure. RFU News has the details, which it published on October 1st in a report where it dubs Russia's Kupyansk offensive a disaster that has led to 22 months of slaughter. The offensive has turned into one of Russia's greatest disasters of the Ukraine war so far, as Storozhenko leads a grinding campaign that sees entire brigades being fed into the meat grinder for practically no gains. The Russian failures in Kupyansk started late in 2022. Much like Izium, Kupyansk had been subjected to Russian occupation during the initial months of the invasion, only for Ukraine to launch a counterattack that pushed the Russians out of the city. Russian armies have hurled themselves against Ukrainian defenses on several axes near Kupyansk, RFU News reports. But each of these has become a graveyard for Russian troops. There are many examples of these failures under Storozhenko, the outlet says. Take Sinkivka. There, Russia attempted to launch an assault using armored columns with the intention of breaking through into the settlement. Ukraine's response was to counter, predominantly using artillery fire, to leave most of the armored column ruined in the forest belt surrounding the settlement. Dead Russians and destroyed vehicles now litter that forest belt, and Russia can't pick itself back up. Ukraine's special forces operatives are active around Sinkivka, where they conduct regular raids to keep Russia's forces pinned down and unable to launch proper assaults. That's happening thanks to Storozhenko's failures. Under the Ukrainian traitor's guidance, Russia's soldiers are doing no better in the southern region of Pishchany. There, Storozhenko came up with a strategy that, if it had worked, it would have split Ukraine's forces in two. With the forces separated, Russia could have then used its manpower advantage to attack two smaller contingents of Ukrainian troops. But like everything else that Storozhenko does, the strategy failed. All that Storozhenko managed to do was create a funnel into which he now pours Russian soldiers. Far from splitting Ukraine's forces in two, that funnel is practically encircled and being attacked from all sides. It's a kill zone, one into which Ukraine sends first-person view drones and artillery rounds to decimate the Russian troops. Any attempt Russia makes to widen the corridor that Storozhenko asked them to create is met with Ukrainian firepower. Russia's forces are exhausted and undersupplied due to being cut off from logistical support once they enter the corridor, making them easy prey for Ukraine's defenders. Who would have guessed that sending troops directly into the middle of a massive Ukrainian defense would have resulted in those troops being cut off and surrounded? Storozhenko didn't guess, at least. And now yet more Russians are dying under his command in Kupyansk. Storozhenko has at least experienced one success in his Kupyansk assignment. He's managed to take the settlement of Dovorichna, which lies north of Kupyansk and is within the Russian bridgehead, RFU News reports. Granted, it took months of assaults against that settlement that cost yet more hundreds of Russian soldiers, and we'll get to the true numbers soon, but Russia has at least claimed that one settlement. But before Storozhenko can hang his hat on this particular achievement, RFU News says, the prize he's managed to gain is practically useless to Russia. You would assume that Dovorichna was a target because it could provide a route into Kupyansk. That must have been what Storozhenko thought, else he wouldn't have dedicated so much time and blood to capturing the settlement. However, Ukraine was prepared for that capture, and it surrounded the routes out of Dovorichna with so much firepower that Russia's soldiers can't advance from the settlement and across the Oskil River to continue an assault in the direction of Kupyansk. There is no prospect of operational success from Dovorichna. So Storozhenko is doing what has been done in the Kupyansk region for 22 months, feeding soldiers into the meat grinder. The bridgehead is static, with Russia's soldiers being cut down by Ukraine's defenses whenever they attempt to advance. The supposedly brilliant military mind of the man who betrayed Ukraine has been able to achieve nothing but lock his forces into a stalemate from which there is no escape. Russia's Kupyansk forces are dying in droves. Storozhenko is the reason why. That brings us to the death count. During 22 months of fighting, Russia has managed to expand the majority of two of its combined arms armies, including the 6th Army that Storozhenko now leads. Russia's casualties in Kupyansk during that 22-month period amount to 13,000 troops, which amounts to about 590 dead, injured, or captured soldiers per month. Bear in mind that Kupyansk is far from a vitally strategic city in the same way as Pokrovsk, Zaporizhia, or Donetsk. Kupyansk itself only has a pre-war population of about 26,600 people, meaning Russia has spent around half of the city's population on making no progress. Storozhenko's failure is complete. The Ukrainian traitor has become one of Russia's greatest embarrassments. Putin is trying to save face, of course. On October 2nd, RBC Ukraine reported that Putin is claiming that Russia's forces have made advances in Kupyansk. The Western grouping of forces has practically taken one of the large settlements, 2/3 of Kupyansk. The city center is already in our hands, while fighting continues in the southern part of the city, Putin claimed in a speech delivered at the Valdai Forum. But the advance is going nowhere near as well as Russia's president claims. Either Putin doesn't know how poorly Storozhenko is actually doing in Kupyansk, or he does, and he's trying to hide the reality. Either way, it's clear that Putin has a dud commander on his hands. The man who betrayed Ukraine and was supposed to offer Russia knowledge of the country that could come from nobody else has only managed to fail in everything that he's been asked to do. In 2014, when Storozhenko first betrayed his countrymen with his order to lay down arms in Crimea, Ukraine was stung by a betrayal that it never saw coming. When Storozhenko started rising through the ranks of Russia's army, Ukraine rightly feared what his knowledge of Ukraine's military and supposed acumen would bring to the table. Now, Storozhenko is the subject of jokes. Casualties have skyrocketed so much since the start of the Kupyansk offensive that some Russian analysts whisper about deliberate sabotage, RFU News says. Ukraine's soldiers know that isn't the case. To them, Storozhenko has devolved from a legitimate threat into an almost accidental spy, a man whose blundering incompetence is such that he's doing more damage to Russia from within than he would have ever been able to do to the country if he'd stuck with Ukraine. That is the ultimate irony. Perhaps it's time that Ukraine starts delivering more of its traitors to Russia. If those traitors experience the same sort of failures as Storozhenko, the Ukraine war might be over in a matter of months. Joking aside, it seems that everybody under Putin's military command is being sent into a bloodbath. That's what's happening in Pokrovsk, at least. Putin's last desperate assault on the city following his failed summer offensive has just resulted in even more Russian casualties. Find out more in our video and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Russia's latest failed assaults and Ukraine's brilliant counterattacks. And thank you as always for watching.